Hello, Warfare class! Welcome to the Hellenistic Age. Sort of. We are going to journey from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Western Mediterranean via the 4th century, where things in technology change. Alexander takes over large portions of half the world, and we set the stage for the coming of Rome. Yes, really. We're also going to talk about the development of artillery and siege-breaking technology. As you may have noticed in the Persian Wars and the little bit we did with the Peloponnesian Wars, the ability to break through a siege and more effectively shoot people from farther and farther away was a real problem, and one that people in the Eastern Mediterranean had been working away busily at. In the Greek-speaking world, this was driven by developments in the Peloponnesian War, and then later as Macedon came to power and set its sights on the Persian Empire, which was barreling towards crisis at a rather rapid pace, having more effective ranged weapons, though unfashionable, became absolutely necessary. So here we go. You jazzed? You ready? Let's do this. The first thing we're going to look at, and hopefully the slide will load, if not, I have it independently in the playlist for this week, is the linothorax or linothorax. Both pronunciations are fine. This is a piece of armor made out of layers of linen that we're not sure were soaked in glue, but maybe soaked in glue. That's, I think, a plausible way of interpreting the evidence, and which has recently been tested by working groups in experimental archaeology, so that's what the movie's about. Now, the linothorax had been around since at least the Persian Wars. The limitations of bronze cuirasses, so these front and back full body armored pieces, were significant. They tended to fail critically. Bronze isn't the best material always, especially if it's being impacted by pointed objects, which indeed bronze is if you're a hoplite. And with the Persian Wars, arrows were penetrating armor at a high rate, so you wanted something that's going to be really good for taking on a lot of arrow fire without failing. You also want something that's going to be somewhat breathable, not too heavy, easy to repair, made out of stuff that isn't hideously expensive, and linen checks all of these boxes. Linen, in fact, is the precursor to Kevlar. Kevlar works on the same principle that linen does. It's just a stronger fiber that's able to be engineered in a way that can stop bullets. But there are no bullets in the ancient world. As you'll notice in the video, bullets don't work too well on the linothorax. But it does work pretty well for a lot of the things that you do use in this world. So without further ado, the linothorax, and then ways to defeat them. So now that you're hopefully sold on a linothorax, you may wonder, how do we go about defeating our enemies when they're wearing one of these things? The advantages against arrows are pretty significant. So that means that you have to come up with better ways to hit your target in a devastating fashion. Now, this is still a problem with Kevlar, too, so this is one that we're still working on a bit. The disadvantage to using a more flexible fiber-based armor is that it works by deforming and blunting the force coming in from whatever projectile is fired at it. When, for instance, a bullet hits Kevlar armor, the bullet is slowed, not stopped, and that force still has to go somewhere. The fibers dissipate it so that it hits a larger area of your chest, and it's able to stop the bullet before it physically penetrates your chest, but the shockwave still travels through your armor, and because the armor bends under the force of the bullet, you're still getting a big crunching to your body. If you've ever been shot while wearing Kevlar, I'm sure you can back me up on this one. That is one way that you can still cause damage through armor. But in order to cause that kind of damage, you need a force so powerful that it's going to break bones even with its force dissipated over an area. Which brings us to sling bullets. I've teased these in an earlier lecture. They don't come out of nowhere, but slingers become even more important as we get into the 4th century and as the linothorax becomes much more widely available. So a sling bullet is sometimes made out of stone, but more frequently it's made out of lead. And if you're not familiar with lead, it's a very heavy metal. It's incredibly dense, which is why it blocks certain forms of radiation. And it's also soft. It has a very low melting point, so it's easy to mold it into the shapes that you need to in the field. So if you carry around a bunch of lead, say on a nice ox cart, you can melt it at night over your campfire and make your sling bullets out of it. In fact, this was how you made bullets right on up into the 1800s. So lead is great for that, not so good for lead poisoning. And if you are a slinger, you would indeed get a high level of lifetime lead poisoning. But lead itself was easy to get in the ancient world. It's a byproduct of silver mining, highly available, very cheap, and it's very, very heavy. Now, you're looking here at 2 sling bullets, 2 of many that have survived from the ancient world. The one on the top I love. They've molded it with a little wasp on it because it's a sling bullet, right? It's a stinger. It's going to hit you like a wasp sting. It doesn't do anything for the effectiveness of the weapon. It's just badass, and it's great for your morale. The one on the bottom, though, is even better. If you can read Greek letters, it's delta, epsilon, chi, alpha, decha. That's Greek for take that. Like, seriously, it's in the imperative. Take that. This is a long and proud tradition in all kinds of ranged weaponry, especially bombs. If you ever are bored and want to feel like you're learning something, Google image World War II bomb graffiti. Fun times. So this has a shape that's nice and aerodynamic. It's a football shape, and you put this into a soft leather sling. Soft leather doesn't survive from the ancient world, but you can see on this coin we have a slinger about to begin to whirl his bullet around. So if you look at this end, he'll be holding the pointy end of his sling bullet in the sling itself. You kind of haul back. In the front of your hand, you're holding the straps, like so. Actually, I should have gone with the right hand because I should whirl with my right. And then you use torsion to get the bullet up to speed. So it's going very, very fast. You increase the kinetic energy, and then you release it in the direction of the enemy army. If you're aiming, you can do this with a high degree of precision. The range isn't great, however. You have to be pretty close to make this shot work. And you also have to train to have this level of accuracy. This was something that you would hire people out of the plains where a lot of people worked as herdsmen and nomads, shepherds, because they would use this technique on a daily basis to drive the sheep, not by hitting them with the bullet, obviously, but by thwacking rocks into the shrubbery to keep the sheep moving in a single direction, and then also to hit predators who were coming after your flocks. So if you're familiar with King David from the Hebrew Bible, then you're familiar with this concept. And this is, of course, how you take down Goliath, is you're so good at throwing these rocks that you can hit a big dude in the forehead, break his skull, cause a traumatic brain injury, and thus win. I mean, skull cracking is still just as effective in the 4th century as it has been all this time. And so that's your first target, is you're trying to hit people in the head. You can cause quite catastrophic damage this way, but even if you hit in the chest and the arms, if you break a bone, you can neutralize someone at long range. And these are pretty cheap projectiles to use to do it. Now, in order to get close enough to sling, you had to be very, very fast. So you notice this fellow here is not wearing clothes. Yes, that's both heroic nudity, but also these were a lightly armored unit who would sometimes wear just the one greave instead of 2, so they could be extra fast but have their front leg protected a bit. So that's the principle, and this doesn't change much. Slingers are a backbone of your ranged military forces throughout the ancient and early medieval, late antique, early modern world even. You don't really get rid of slingers until firearms become a viable weapon on the battlefield. So when you're thinking about your ancient units and your D&D campaigns, it's not all about the arrows. Sometimes you want a rock or a big honk of lead. Surprise! Costume change. Yeah, this slide somehow didn't record, so let's try this again. Okay, the Siege of Plataea. There's so many reasons to talk about this incident from the Peloponnesian Wars, but where I'm going with this here is that the Siege of Plataea highlighted for Greek speakers the necessity of coming up with more efficient ways to break sieges. And this will become more clear as I tell you the story of the Siege of Plataea. Plataea was an ally of Athens, and it was in the middle of Peloponnesian League territory. There were mountains intervening between Athens and Plataea, but they had been bro city-states for a long, long time. Remember, the Plataeans showed up at Marathon. Sparta did not. Plataea was also the site where Xerxes' army was finally turned back in 479 BCE. As a result, the Plataeans were granted certain rights and privileges, and they were supposed to have a protected status. So when the Peloponnesian War broke out, they were pretty confident that they could stay allies with Athens, despite being neighbors with Athens' frenemy, actually more enemy than frenemy, Thebes. Haha! Thebes, however, saw an opportunity, tried to initiate a coup. It blew up in Thebes' face. The Plataeans drove the Thebans out with rocks to the face. And then the Thebans got the Spartans to agree to lay siege to Plataea. Now, this was bad news for Plataea because with the Spartan siege, they were essentially cut off from easily gained support. So they hoped that Athens would mount a rescue mission to break the siege and allow them to keep on being Plataea. But from Athens' point of view, this was not a great strategic plan. It would have been incredibly costly to cross the mountains through, let me remind you, the Spartan siege of Athens. So Athens itself was under land siege by Sparta, Plataea also under siege by Sparta. So Athens would have had to break through two Spartan and allied besieging armies to get to Plataea in the first place. It also would have negated their plan, that is, stay behind the long walls and don't let the Spartans touch you. To rescue Plataea, they would have to leave the long walls, march their army over a mountain, and get to Plataea, fight another army. It wasn't a viable solution. So instead, Athens gave sanctuary to Plataeans who were able to get out. And at one point, the Spartans allowed a group of Plataeans, including most of the women and children and infirm elderly, to leave the city. Those who remained behind in Plataea were people of fighting age and support personnel, including a number of women who stayed to cook, clean, take care of sanitation. Stuff that does not sound important unless you've been in a military situation where you didn't have somebody feeding you and providing sanitation. It's incredibly important, and just as important as any other part of a protracted engagement, which a siege is. So, Plataea begins as a city with walls, which is what we've got in diagram number 1, which I am now labeling with a poorly drawn number 1. Okay. So far, so good. Sparta encircles the walls with their Theban allies, lays siege, creates a blockade, standard stuff. But Plataea had a lot of supplies on hand and a pretty nice wall, too. And this meant that the Spartans had to really dig in for a long haul. And every minute they were sitting outside of the walls of Plataea was another minute they weren't sending their army, say, to Athens or to other Athenian allies. It was becoming a bit of a time and resource suck. So Sparta needed to get through this wall. However, they didn't have great equipment to do it with. So what they do next is they create diagram A2. Let me explain what's going on here. So the MS Paint brown kind of gloopy circle around the walls of Plataea is an earthenworks wall that Sparta began to build. The idea here was that they would raise the ground level until it was high enough that they could just cross the wall of Plataea, hop over onto the other side, and take the city. This is not a horrible idea. We are going to see it again, despite vast leaps and bounds forward in siege-breaking technology. But at this point, the Plataeans did what is a sensible thing to do. They began to undermine the Spartan wall. So they dig under their own wall below where the Spartans are creating these earthenwork walls. So even as the Spartans are building up this wall here on the edge, it's beginning to sink into the ground because the Plataeans are digging the foundation out from under it. Remember, the Plataeans are in a siege, right? They have nothing to do but dig, and they're super duper bored, so this is a great plan. The Spartans also have nothing to do but build this wall, so it becomes a bit of an exercise in futility. So this is clever, but where this becomes next level is the dark gray line inside of Plataea. So the brown arrow is the Spartan plan, right? The Spartans are trying to cross the wall of Plataea. The Plataeans begin disassembling the houses inside the walls, and they use that rubble to build a second inner wall. So now Plataea has two walls built by Plataeans, the light gray wall, that's the original wall, and this dark gray wall inside the wall, which utterly messes up the Spartan plan, because now the Spartans can't just hop over the wall onto the other side, take ladders at night, and go in and invade Plataea. If they manage to cross that first wall, they're going to have to jump down into a ditch between two walls where the Plataeans can throw rocks on their heads until they die a lot. Now the Spartans have to figure out a way to cross two walls, and they can't build up a pile of earth between the walls, right? That's not going to work. The Plataeans aren't going to let them do that. Meanwhile, the Plataeans are digging earth out from under the wall, and then they're using that earth that the Spartans conveniently put into the earthenwork wall to reinforce the inside of this new wall. So Sparta has to come up with plan C. I think we're on plan C by now. This is diagram number 3. You'll notice this plan is more walls, because that's all folks have at this point, is more walls. The Spartans build a second wall, a palisade wall, so wooden with some watchtowers studded along it on the outside of the greater Plataea area. So you've got the Spartan earthenwork wall here, and then I'm going to use blue to scribble on the outer palisade wall here. Why is more walls the solution, you may ask? Great question. So Plataeans had been able to kind of sneak out in a steady trickle since the beginning of this siege. It wasn't a foolproof blockade, but by putting this extra wall, Sparta made it so that Plataeans had to go through first an earthenwork wall and then this palisade wall to get out of Plataea. This also meant that Spartans could position sentries at regular intervals on this outside wall, looking in at all times so they could see the Plataeans coming out. This was really bad news to the Plataeans, because now the Spartans could just stand on the wall and shoot them with arrows when they tried to break through this arrangement. And by now, this is several years down the road. This siege goes on from 431 BCE to 427 BCE, I think, is when this finally comes to its dire and unpleasant conclusion. So, this isn't just about keeping the Plataeans in, though. The Spartans are also thinking about the Athenians sending rescue parties, because by now, Athens is under a lot of pressure to rescue Plataea. Remember, Plataea has special status because it's the site where the Persians were driven back in the Persian invasion. They are the allies of Athens at Marathon. If Athens can't bust its closest and most intimate and trusted ally out of a siege situation, what the heck good is the Delian League? Why join the Athenian League if they're not going to be able to rescue you, right? Well, right. So the Spartans are now worried that the Athenians are indeed going to try to break through this siege. By having this extra wall around the outside of this besieged city, they make it much more difficult for Athens to break through. We're going to see this again. Caesar does this at Alesia, so even though technology improves, this playbook is still a solid playbook, and should you ever find yourself in a post-apocalyptic situation where you don't have a lot of battering rams handy and you need to assault a walled city for reasons, I hope they are very good reasons, but if you do, I hope this will be useful to you. If so, write me a thank you note. Give me some gold. That would be good too. Or supplies, wool. Wool is nice. But we're not yet in that post-apocalyptic situation. It's only November. Give it time. Gosh. Right. So how does this end? Well, Athens never comes to rescue Plataea, and finally the Plataeans, starving, out of resources, out of options, decide they're going to throw themselves on the mercy of the Spartans, still thinking that, you know, we're the recognized co-saviors of Greece with Athens. We helped turn the Persians back at Marathon. We helped turn them back again at, well, here. So surely the Spartans are going to spare our lives if we throw ourselves on their mercy. So they surrender, they cross the blockades, they come up to the Spartans and they're like, okay, we're done. At this point, the Spartans, pressured by the Thebans, remember the Thebans started this whole mess by trying to stage a revolt in Plataea. It didn't work out. So the Thebans are highly motivated to make an example out of Plataea, and the Spartans need Thebes. Thebes is the strongest, closest city-state to Athens, and it is vital to the Spartan war effort. In fact, after the Peloponnesian War, Thebes is going to be the next Athens, right? So Thebes is looking forward to a bright future. They're not quite there yet, though. Sparta still needs to keep them on side. So what they end up doing is they throw a trial right there on the battlefield, and there is only one question asked of the Plataeans on trial. They line them up, and one by one they ask them, okay, what have you done to help the Spartans and their allies in this war? The Plataeans are like, nothing, because we're an ally of Athens, which is like the other side of this war, so kind of our whole point that we just had this siege for several years with you over is that we are not, in fact, helping you because you invaded us, you know. And the Spartans are like, oh, you didn't help us? Well then, death penalty for you. And then they systematically execute every single survivor. All of these folks who surrendered end up killed en masse, just boop, gone. This looks bad for Sparta. But Sparta's not the only person doing this in this conflict. This isn't even an unusual thing to do. It's unusual in that it's something that Greek speakers are doing to other Greek speakers. Normally this kind of complete liquidation in a war, both by killing people of fighting age, in other instances, people were sold into slavery en masse, and then the proceeds pocketed by the victors. If you identified as a Hellene, as a Greek, you weren't supposed to do this to other Greeks. Barbarians, cool, totally cool, but to other Greeks, that was considered sketchy. It was considered disloyal and impolite. So this looked very bad for Sparta in 427, but Athens ends up doing a similar thing to neutral Milos in 415, so nobody comes out of this conflict looking particularly good. My point here, though, is that this long, drawn-out, agonizing death by bludgeoning at the Siege of Plataea highlighted for the Greek-speaking world in the Eastern Mediterranean writ large, because of course it's an international community here, the need for more efficient ways to end sieges efficiently and quickly within like a year or less. So let's have a look at these techniques. What kinds of stuff did people come up with to break sieges? Watch on. So this is one more option for dealing with sieges, and this is the first one that the Spartans come up with. You'll note the date, 424 BCE. So this they develop within years of the end of the Siege of Plataea, because they realize that the build a wall plan has very limited usefulness in the field. So this is the fire raiser. I could not find an illustration of it, so I drew you a picture with MS Paint. Behold my art, my beautiful art. Okay, so let me explain what's going on here. At the far end, and this is the end that goes up against the enemy wall, so the enemy wall is going to be like here. There is a cauldron in which there is a very hot coal fire. You can also do this with charcoal, just the hottest fire substances you have, soaked in oil, so it's really good and hot. And this contraption here is a long cylinder at the end of which are Smith's bellows. And you operate the Smith's bellows to blow oxygen onto the fire, so you heat it up hotter and hotter and hotter. Essentially what you're doing is creating a portable smithy furnace with a long-range oxygen pump so that you can get the fire going really, really, really bright and hot. So you move this up against the enemy wall. Now, if you were just standing against the enemy's wall with a pot of fire and a handheld bellows, they could, shoot you in the face with an arrow, that's an arrow, and then you'd be dead. But this extended range and then this bellows that you could then put underneath a kind of shielding hut like so, makes it so you can get the fire up against the walls, you can pump it full of oxygen, and then you can superheat the stone of the walls, and then remove the fire raiser so that the wall then rapidly cools and then cracks. You do this enough times and you cause a critical failure in the stonework shell. And ancient walls were only faced in ashlar masonry, so the blocks of stone were just the first layer. Ancient walls, you'd have a layer of masonry on the inside, a layer of masonry on the outside, and then this inside bit would be filled with loose rubble. That's not a bug, it's a feature, because that loose rubble creates extra shock-absorbing structural integrity, right? When this wall takes force, the loose rubble absorbs and mitigates the force so that the shock wave doesn't propagate as efficiently through the stone. But using heat, you crack that facing stone, and once this facing stone is cracked, then the rubble falls out through the opening in the crack and the wall slumps and fails. It creates a break that you can then get through. You can also put this up against wooden sections of walls, and many sections did have wooden parts in them, or beams. Sometimes wooden structural supports would be in among the masonry, and then of course you would have wood on doors sometimes. Some walls were faced entirely in wood, depending on how wealthy this city-state was. So depending on the wood situation, you could use the fire raiser to literally set the walls on fire. You could also use it to apply fire to other people's siege engines, to ships if you brought it on board ships, but you should be careful because fire on your ship can also burn your ship, so, make sure that you're OSHA compliant when you use your fire raiser. But this is a great idea. So this is the first thing that Greek speakers came up with to resolve siege situations. Oh, but it would not be the last. Let us continue our tour. Before we get there, here is a surviving bolt. There are very, very few of these surviving, but this is one of them. There would have been some kind of leather or feathered fletchings here and here to make sure it flies straight, although in larger crossbow configurations, you eventually do away with the fletchings because you just don't need them for it to fly straight anymore. It's solid enough that it's going to fly through the air without deviating that much. There's also no way to rifle this kind of motion. Unlike a javelin, you can't put a strap in order to put spin on the projectile, so you have to rely on force and speed. But there's enough force and speed that this thing's going to be going pretty fast. And if you look at the tip, this bodkin tip, this long tapered tip, is for armor penetration, specifically for linen armor penetration. This allows you to get in deep through the layers. If you have a flared barbed tip, it's going to get caught up on the fibers and it's not going to penetrate as well. Likewise, if you're trying to get through muscle and hide to hit a horse in a vital organ, you're going to need it to be a lot more sturdy. So that's why this looks the way it does. And this just gets bigger and bigger as these mounted crossbows get bigger and bigger. Now here's where this goes to in the next 25 years. So this is around 375 BCE or so. You have the introduction of the Oxybeles. Oxybeles is also a fine way to pronounce this thing. This is the first artillery-mounted crossbow. So like the Gastraphetes, you have a bolt that's mounted on a tray, but now instead of leaning your body onto a sliding tray in order to pull back the string into the bow, they're using ratcheted cranks. So on the end here, these two cranks allow you to use mechanical energy to pull a ratcheted cylinder back, and the ratchets allow you to pull only in one direction, so it's like a one-way valve. So as you pull, it'll click, 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 click. And then when you reach forward again, it'll hold in place, so you can just continue to crank, 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 crank to pull the string back. And now that we're putting ridiculous poundage onto the arms of this bow, the arms themselves are reinforced with rope and laminated sections of horn, and they've got a recurve to them to increase the poundage still more. So these are very sturdy green laminated bow arms that you're pulling back on with strings that were made of some combination of horsehair and sinew. The two in combination create a very strong, sturdy, and springy string that gives you a nice shelf life and a good pull. So you use the ratchets to pull it back, and because the tray is mounted, in early models it's difficult to range it. You can't raise and lower the angle of the central tray very well, and you have to physically rotate the whole thing in order to point it at the oncoming army. Likewise, they have to travel on a cart because you can't carry it in your hands, you can't get it on a horse. So in order to have one of these with your army, you have to have a supply chain that's able to drag them around. But if you can do that, this is a great thing to have on the field because it sends bolts at enormous speed with enormous punch right into the enemy lines, and it can take out the cavalry. And if you're very good and have enough of these, you can neutralize the cavalry before it executes a charge maneuver on you. This is important because the thing that's starting to become a problem for the citizen armies of 4th century Greece is that powers with large cavalry are now able to field them and are beginning to bring them to bear both on Greek possessions outside of the Greek mainland, but eventually into the Greek mainland itself. And this is not to say there aren't cavalry units in the Greek mainland. There are, but they tend to be small, and they don't tend to be as well-trained or specialized as, say, Macedonian cavalry. or Persian cavalry for that matter, which is still something that people are very worried about, right? Persians haven't gone anywhere. So, what can we do to make this even more badass? So glad you asked. Here we are. This is another view of the Oxybeles. Again, this is the 375 model. This one is in full firing mode, and this particular reconstruction has plates that include this arm here, which is hooked up to a sliding support table. So as you slide this arm backwards and forwards, you can alter the angle of the tray so that you can range your shots up and down so that you can aim more precisely at things. These reconstructions look slightly different because none of these have survived in person. The metal bits survive a little bit, but everything we know about these is from military manuals that describe the how-to instructions. So this is our best guess. We're pretty sure these looked like this during this period. Okay. So here is Oxybeles Part 2. This is a more modern Oxybeles. This is now from 340 BCE, so we're another 30-35 years down the road. And there have been some improvements. You'll notice the base is a little bit lighter, also taller because this is a much taller bolt firing mechanism. And the tray has also been extended far in front of the firing arms. This is in order to steady the shot so it flies longer and truer. Now the basics are still here. You still have the same ratcheting mechanism along the side. These bronze teeth are the ratchets that hold the string as you pull it back with these cranks. We're still using a crank and a chain to pull the string back. But the one new thing is the torsion mechanism that each of the arms are attached to. So in here you can see these vertical strings going up and down, and then each arm is inserted into the strings. This is a stroke of genius that's able to improve and vastly extend the range and the force of artillery mechanisms from this point forward. Allow me to demonstrate what I mean by torsion here. Hopefully this will work. What I've done is taken a pair of scarves and tied them to a point at the bottom of my baby gate. All right, so there are scarves. You can see them here. What I'm going to do now is to insert, this is actually a distaff, but pretend for a minute it's the arm of your Oxybeles. So this is one of your firing arms. And what I'm doing is twisting it over and over and over again into the scarves until it's under a lot of tension. But the tension, instead of being on the wood of the firing arm, let me move it out here, is instead taken up by the twisted fibers, and twisted fibers can hold a whole lot more force. So the arm is now able to be rigid, but you're not sacrificing poundage at all, and you've also made a firing platform that is a lot easier and cheaper to repair. And then when I let go of this arm, I'm going to put my elbow down so it has something to slap into. Ow! That hurt. I've created a firing platform that can repeatedly fire over and over and over again without as much stress on the wood. In fact, this is just a regular old piece of pine, and I'm putting it under a lot of stress right now. Ratchet it up even harder. I'm going to hit myself in the face. This is going to be bad. All right, thoughts and prayers, guys. Ow! That worked. That worked really well. So that is the basis of a torsion firing mechanism, and you can make one of these at home. Try it with like a piece of string and a pencil. Try it on your little brother. I'm sure that'll go over well and won't backfire at all. Don't blame me, though. This sounds like how I end up getting sued, doesn't it? At any rate, that is a torsion mechanism, and it is a game changer for the world of ancient artillery. This means that you can put enormous force behind your bolts so that you can send them up over besieged walls. You can fire them from the top of your ship into somebody else's ship. You can put fire arrows in them and fire them. And that is not the only thing you can fire with this, because this isn't just good for arrows. I'll show you what I mean. Meet the lithobolos. Sometimes you'll hear it called the lithobolos. That's fine too. I'm pretty sure the accent's on the omicron though. So lithos. Oh, I should have explained what oxybeles means. So oxy is the same root that gives us oxygen, oxycontin. Oxy means sharp or strong. Beles means missile launcher. So an oxybeles is a sharp missile launcher. It just sounds cooler in Greek, I guess. So, but if that helps you remember it, go for it. So the lithobolos, that bolos root means throwing. It's the same root that gives us ballistics through a slightly different process. That's a complicated explanation that is not relevant now. Lithos gives us lith, like a monolith is a single standing stone. It's a lithograph. Yeah, so a lithos is a rock, and that's essentially what this is. This is a rock thrower. It sounds so much cooler in Greek, doesn't it? Rock thrower, lithobolos, badass. Yeah, so the lithobolos uses exactly the same principle we were just seeing in the Oxybeles, right? There are two arms in a torsion mechanism on a firing tray, but instead of the string slotting into a bolt, instead the string widens to hold a rounded rock. And you use the ratcheting mechanism, a much longer ratcheting mechanism, to pull that rock back. So this is the ultimate marriage of a sling bullet and a crossbow. This is a rock thrower. And this, I mean, yeah, you can throw rocks at anything and it's going to cause some damage, but this is primarily for banging down walls, especially the tops of walls, so that you can knock the defensive emplacements out from a defensive wall work and start picking people off the top. You need this kind of siege breaking technology for reasons we're going to get into with more advanced siege breaking technology. But you remember, or may remember, that even since the Bronze Age, walls have been pretty much impenetrable, yeah? Athens' long walls worked really well to keep the Spartans out, no matter how many olive trees they burned, no matter how many plagues there were in Athens. Well, there was just one, but one was enough, right? Walls, there wasn't much you could do to take them down, really. You just kind of sat outside of them and waited. And that is tedious and cold and uncomfortable and slow. You know, sometimes you don't have time to besiege a city forever and ever and ever, years on end, which is what ended up happening often in the Peloponnesian War. Okay, so we need to start breaking down the walls faster so we can get done with the siege and move on to our next objective. The lithobolos is the beginning of technology for breaking down walls faster and resolving siege situations more quickly. What a time to be alive. Now, that's not it for getting over walls. There is the Sambuca, which, yeah, sounds just like the drink. The words are related. This word comes first, though. Greeks weren't sitting around drinking Sambuca, which is delicious. I would love a Sambuca right about now. I'm going to finish this lecture first, though. Okay. So the Sambuca was invented by a dude named Damis of Colophon. A great Greek name, Damis. It means the conqueror or the tamer. And really, that's apt, because this does work really well for getting your soldiers to the top of the wall the faster to break a siege with. This is a covered siege ramp, and here we're looking at it in one of its two forms. This is a form that uses two triremes connected at the top with decking. So what they've done is take two triremes, and then you see at the top there's a decking that's been extended over both of the triremes to make a more stable platform. And then there are two cranes, each connected to the mid and tail section of the ramp. The ramp itself is enclosed, so this is like a tunnel on a crane. And crane technology had been around for a while before the 4th century. It was initially developed in construction and theater. In theater, they'd use it to lower people playing the god from the sky, and they would come down on the stage and they would be like, "Everyone, here's the conclusion of the play," which is where we get the phrase Deus ex machina, God coming out of the crane. So here we're using the crane for warfare purposes, because a lot of these cities were on the seafront, and harbors like the Piraeus were fortified. So what if you don't want to just besiege Athens for the next 30 years? What if you want to get into the Piraeus sometime this year? Well, you sail up to the edge of the seawall, and then you use these cranes to lower your Sambuca until its outlet is even with the top of the walls. And then you send your marines up through this armored tunnel to their exit, where the Sambuca's top meets the enemy walls. They then unload, storm the walls, and take the town, hopefully. Now, you're going to need more than one Sambuca to do this for obvious reasons. If you think about it for a minute, yeah, it takes a while to get this lowered. You're going to see this thing coming even at night, and you're going to kill the first people to run out of this. But if several Sambuca are coming at you all at once, all of them lowering, while somebody with a Lithobolos is picking you off of the top of your ramparts, eventually enough people are going to get into your city that they can storm the walls. So this is great. You can invade a port. You can use this on dry land, but it gets a little more complicated. So let's look at the dry land version of the Sambuca. Oh, good, I did put this slide on here. So the Sambuca is named after a musical instrument of the same name. So the Sambuca was a kind of harp, and here you have a museum reconstruction of one. It's got two arms, and then the strings are arrayed like this, in the same way that the strings on the ship-bound Sambuca are arrayed. But you don't necessarily need to have a crane to make this work. If you're going to use a Sambuca on land, then instead of mounting it to a ship with a crane, like, it's really hard to move a crane up to the city walls without something going horribly wrong, right? People are going to see that crane coming. They're going to start shooting your horses or your oxen or you, or setting the crane on fire. Like, it's impractical. So instead, what they do is they armor the area at the base of the crane here, where the mules or the oxen pulling this thing are going to be housed. So you armor the oxen, you have the oxen pull the bottom from below, and then when it's on site, you use a counterweight system to lower it over the enemy walls, which is what's going on here. So this is a bucket of rocks. It looks like a bucket of rocks. It's a bucket of rocks because it's a bucket of rocks. The bucket of rocks, as you're taking this across the battlefield, are going to keep it so that it's back-weighted. But then, when you're ready to storm the city gates, you start tossing rocks off the end of this bucket until it's light enough that the ramp of the Sambuca comes down over top of the enemy walls, like so. And then you have your men either climb by ladders on the backside, where the enemy guarding the wall can't hit you. There also might have been inside ladders where you could go up through this armored section and climb, and then go through this armored pathway, which would also be covered with wet hides that would keep it from being set on fire too, which is important. You do not want the Sambuca to catch on fire while you're trying to storm the enemy, yeah? So then you and your comrades would subsequently enter the city, kill people, declare victory. That's the plan, at least. Now, there are many ways this can go wrong. If it's muddy, it can get stuck in the mud. This isn't very easy to drive. It's big, it's impractical, and it's not something that's easy to bring along with you with your army. These are gigantic. These are bigger than the carts that you're using to carry your supplies. What seems to have happened is that people would build the Sambuca on site. So you'd bring a bunch of random construction materials, including your hardware and your fittings, and then you'd kind of IKEA this thing while you were waiting out the siege. And this makes sense because when you're besieging a town, you've got time. You're just sitting there, basically, waiting for the enemy to starve to death, and this will take a while. So while you're there, why not start a construction project like a Sambuca? Several Sambucae, and just keep throwing them at the wall until eventually your people manage to bust in. Good plan. So here's one further iteration of the Sambuca. So this one has the armoring pulled away so you can see the wheel mechanism. This thing isn't built for speed. It's pretty impractical. This reconstruction has also suggested a ladder dropping down from the entrance end, so you can pull this up above even the ramparts and then have people come down on ladders from above and then kind of drop in on the enemies. This prevents the enemy from, say, throwing fire down the front of your Sambuca. If you're here, the wall is here, your enemies are here, or even here, drop down. But again, this is only as good as the city walls are tall. So another thing we see during this period is city walls start getting taller and taller and taller and taller. So there's a bit of an arms race going on as siege technology improves. Which brings us to the Tortoise Ram. Now, you may have been wondering why they didn't think of this earlier, and indeed this is one of the first things they do think of. This is already being developed at about the same time that the Gastraphetes is being developed. So the Tortoise Ram allows you to counteract the single biggest problem with a regular old ram. Even in the Bronze Age, it seems that people had thought of taking a tree trunk and banging it into the enemy gate a bunch of times until the enemy gate falls in. Like, that's siege breaking 101. However, it is kind of a suicide mission to be in the first 2 or 3 or 10 shifts of people bringing a tree trunk up to the city gates, because city gates are built so that it is really easy to pick people off while they're banging at your door. And all you need to do is just keep picking people off in that near. You can only have so many people on a ram at once. So in order for people to live through a ramming expedition, you need to come up ways to protect them and your ram. And that's what we've got going on here. So the Tortoise Ram is pretty much what it sounds like. It is a walled hut that surrounds your ram. The ram itself, instead of being handheld, is suspended from the roof beam with chains at the back. So that's one chain, and at the front, another chain, so that it can swing, and you can use the gathered force from swinging and rebound to make repetitive strikes faster and more impactful. This also means that the people operating the ram aren't going to get fatigued as fast because they're not holding the weight of the ram. So the ram can get bigger and heavier until it's as heavy as this contraption can manage. Then because it's got this armored hut with several layers, wooden on the bottom, and then sometimes sheets of metal or bronze or rawhide above it, and then on the very top you'd have wet hides so that they, again, couldn't set this on fire. You could sit there while they pour boiling oil and molten pitch and whatnot on top of you and continue to operate your ram until the enemy gate cracks in. Or if you're working on a thin enough wall, you can also bash away at the rocks of the wall until the wall itself is undermined and collapses under its own weight. This is a classic. The battering ram doesn't really get phased out in any meaningful way until firearms are big enough to make them obsolete. This one's a classic. So if civilization collapses and you find yourself in a Mad Max kind of situation, remember the Tortoise Ram and send me a nice thank you note. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, but don't say I never told you anything useful. One last thing about this ram, and all rams. The end is reinforced with metal, usually bronze, although for land battles iron is fine for this, in a nice wedge shape, just like naval rams. And that's because it's a very effective shape for repeated stress that won't mess up your mechanism, and also it shatters wood in a very satisfying fashion. So finally, let me introduce you to one of my favorites. This is not something that's a Greek speaker's invention, but rather this is something that was invented and perfected by the Phoenicians. Now, this isn't a new concept. The idea of taking old ships, setting them on fire, and pushing them into the enemy's ships has been around for a while. We talked about it back with the Battle of Salamis. But the Phoenicians took this to the next level. As you would expect, the Phoenicians were freaking geniuses when it came to seacraft. Their ships were in ways we don't completely understand, but they were known for being very fast, very accurate, and also their seamanship was incredible. So yeah, this is the level of quality mayhem causing that we've come to expect from our Phoenician friends. Right. So this happens at the Siege of Tyre, which we'll talk about a little more when we discuss Alexander's greatest hits. So what they've done is you have an old ship and you've set the decking on fire. So far, so good. Like this part is old. But what's new about this is that on the mainmast, instead of hanging a sail from the mainmast here, instead there are two open-top buckets that are full of a mixture of wax, fat, and olive oil that in proportions discussed in ancient texts, these how-to manuals I was mentioning, when we've tested it in modern experimental archaeology, it creates a very hot, very fast fire, and then the grease is still grease, so it's a hot grease fire. So water doesn't put it out. Water actually makes it worse. Water spreads the oil to more wood and then just makes the fire bigger. So what you do is you sail this contraption up to the enemy fleet, you bang it into something, either another ship, a seawall, whatever it is that you want to set on fire, this. And then when the ship comes to a stop, these buckets are tipped over because remember they're open on the top. So the ship stops, the bucket swings this way, it tips over, and then it spills this mixture of fat onto the fire. But then the fire material is already moving forward as well, because although the ship stops, the loose material on the top of the ship doesn't. So the impact force pushes this mixture of fat, oil, wax, and flammable material all together into this ball of flammable stuff, which then splooshes into the enemy fleet, thus causing a massive fire incident. It's freaking brilliant. And if we still had wooden ships, this would still work. And in fact, this was a standard tactic that was in use well into the 1700s. People were still using fire ships in the early 1800s. Versions of fire ships were used even beyond that point, because you can still cause a lot of fire damage when you're dealing with metal ships. Fire is your worst enemy at sea. Especially in World War I. Oh my God, the safety regulations in World War I and World War I ships are just... But irrelevant because we're still in the 4th century BCE. But behold, the genius of Phoenician arms races. Here is one final stop in our tour of machines of destruction and how to cross walls with them. This one is very late. You'll notice the date is post-Alexander. Alexander dies in 323 BCE. This is the very end of the 4th century in 305. And this is the Hellepolis, the city taker of Demetrius Poliorcetes. So that his name means Demetrius, the besieger of cities. It's a great name. So he was one of these folks in the late Hellenistic period who tried to take over Macedon. You don't need to remember anything about him per se, but Google him if you're interested. He's very cool. One of the things that he and his engineers come up with is this gadget, the Hellepolis. This is the first mobile siege tower, and it is going to be something that is very useful to a number of generals. We're going to see it again when the Romans besieged Jerusalem in 70 CE, so stay tuned. The Hellepolis has some features that make it more competitive than, say, a Sambuca. A Sambuca is top-heavy, it's easy to tip over, it's kind of unwieldy, it's got a lot of parts that can break down, there isn't a great exit point for the city walls. So what the Hellepolis does is it combines the convenience of a mobile firing platform with the height of a Sambuca and the internal mobility of a Tortoise Ram. And in fact, it can serve as a ram housing too. You can put a ram on the bottommost level, or at least the almost bottom level here. Ah, dang nabbit. Well, that slide changed quickly, but that's all right. We can go from here. So on the previous illustration, you saw the drawbridge lowering down. So that's one of the features, is that you can lower a drawbridge and board the city walls from eye level, or rather top of the wall level. But all along this multi-level siege tower, and this would have been made of wood with a soaked wet outer casing that would be armored to prevent damage from artillery and such. There were artillery emplacements along the sides, so these windows would open up, and you would put either a Lithobolos or an Oxybeles in one of these windows so that you could shoot spikes and fire off rocks to break down the walls. So you could open a volley at point blank range from this thing while staying armored. And it's driven inside with this series of cranks and gears. So you would have people or sometimes oxen pushing on these arms coming out of the central axis on the bottom. Use my red pen so you can see that better. And this would turn a crank that would rotate the wheels housed inside the bottom of the tower. So this tower would move very, very slowly from this internal drive mechanism that would be shielded from attack. So you couldn't shoot the things driving the machine. And this is important in the age of oxen and other animals used for pulling siege weaponry, because you could just neutralize it by taking out the oxen. This time, no, it's buried in the bottom of the Hellepolis.
No.
Inside you have stairways and ramps leading to each different level of the siege tower. And at the top, you could create this upper level that's higher than the walls, so you could fire downwards onto your enemies inside the walls, which is a handy trick. So this is just the first of many innovations to the siege tower, but it's a nice last step. So by the time we enter the 100s BCE, so the 200s BCE or the 3rd century BCE, we have a variety of things to take down walls, and walls have to become bigger, higher, stronger, more well defended. How does this work out for folks? We'll find out next time when we go to Rome and Carthage. Later, taters.